June 1960. 60,000 feet above the Soviet Union, an American pilot named Francis Gary Powers was doing something that, officially, was not happening. He was flying a mission that, officially, did not exist. He was piloting an aircraft that, officially, had never been built. And he was photographing military installations belonging to the most powerful communist state on Earth, in a plane that was supposed to be completely, utterly, and permanently beyond the reach of anything the Soviets could throw at it. He was wrong about that last part. But before we get to the day everything went wrong, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when a small group of American engineers and pilots and spymasters looked at the new reality of the Cold War and decided that the only way to know what the enemy was doing was to fly directly over him and take pictures. This is the story of the Lockheed U-2. The plane that changed the Cold War. The plane that embarrassed a president, nearly started a nuclear war, and redrew the boundaries of what aviation and espionage could achieve. The plane that, for 4 extraordinary years, flew where nothing else could fly and saw what nothing else could see. The plane that could not be shot down. Until it was. To understand why the U-2 existed, you have to understand the particular flavor of terror that gripped Washington in the early 1950s. It was not a simple fear. It was a complicated, layered, deeply rational anxiety about an enemy that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, an enemy whose capabilities were largely unknown, whose intentions were deeply hostile, and whose nuclear arsenal was growing with a speed that American intelligence could only guess at. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, years earlier than most American analysts had predicted. It had tested a hydrogen bomb in August 1953, again, ahead of schedule, ahead of what the Americans thought was possible. The Korean War had demonstrated that the Communist bloc was willing to spend blood freely in pursuit of its objectives. And in the Kremlin, a new leadership was emerging from the chaos following Stalin's death in March 1953. A leadership whose intentions were, if anything, even harder to read than Stalin's had been. The specific fear that haunted the Pentagon and the CIA was the fear of surprise. The fear of waking up one morning to discover that Soviet bombers were already in the air, carrying nuclear weapons toward American cities, and that there was no warning, no time to respond, no possibility of defense. This was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a rational extrapolation from what American intelligence knew, or, more accurately, from what it didn't know, about Soviet military capabilities. The problem was geography. The Soviet Union was enormous, the largest country on Earth, sprawling across 11 time zones, its military installations buried in the interior of a continent that American aircraft simply could not reach without being detected and destroyed. The Soviets had built an air defense network of impressive depth and sophistication, radar stations, anti-aircraft artillery, and increasingly capable jet interceptors. Any conventional aircraft that tried to fly over Soviet territory would be detected, intercepted, and shot down. The intelligence blackout over the Soviet heartland was essentially total. President Dwight Eisenhower understood this problem better than almost anyone. He was a former Supreme Allied commander, a man who had spent years thinking about the relationship between intelligence and military decision-making, about how you fight a war when you don't know what the enemy has or where he's keeping it. He knew that the worst decision a commander could make was a decision based on ignorance, and he knew that the United States government was making decisions about nuclear weapons, about defense spending, about alliance commitments, based on almost complete ignorance of Soviet military capabilities. What he needed was a way to see inside the Soviet Union. A way to fly over it, photograph it, and bring those photographs back. without getting caught, without getting shot down, without starting the nuclear war that everyone was trying so desperately to avoid. The answer came from an unexpected direction. In 1953, a small team of engineers at Lockheed's secret development facility in Burbank, California, a facility so secret it didn't officially exist, known to its inhabitants simply as the Skunk Works, began thinking about a problem that most aeronautical engineers of the era had considered essentially insoluble. The problem was altitude. The Soviet radar network and Soviet jet interceptors could threaten any aircraft flying below about 50,000 feet. If you could fly above 60,000 feet, above 70,000 feet, you would be beyond the reach of radar, beyond the reach of interceptors, beyond the reach of anti-aircraft missiles. The Soviets simply had nothing that could reach that high. The sky at that altitude was, in a very real sense, free. The engineering challenge was that no aircraft in existence could fly at 70,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is so thin that conventional aircraft engines cannot generate enough thrust to sustain flight. The aerodynamic forces are completely different from those at normal altitudes. The structural stresses on the airframe are different. The physiological challenges for any pilot who might be flying the aircraft are extreme. At 70,000 feet, if your pressure suit failed, your blood would boil in seconds. The engineer who solved this problem, or rather, who found a way to think about it differently enough to make a solution possible, was Kelly Johnson, the head of the Skunk Works and one of the most talented aircraft designers in American history. Johnson was a compact, intense, deeply practical man who believed that good engineering meant finding the simplest possible solution to a complex problem and then executing it with obsessive precision. He had already designed some of the most capable aircraft in the American inventory. The U-2 would be his masterpiece. Johnson's insight was deceptively simple. If you wanted to fly at extreme altitude, you needed to solve two problems simultaneously. You needed an engine that could function in the thin air, and you needed an airframe that was light enough for that engine to push to the required altitude. Conventional aircraft design involved a constant trade-off between performance and structural strength. You built in more strength to make the aircraft durable, but more strength meant more weight, and more weight meant you needed more power. And more power meant more engine, and more engine meant more weight. The cycle could not be broken by conventional thinking. Johnson broke it by accepting a constraint that every other aircraft designer would have rejected as unworkable: the U-2 would be fragile. Deliberately, intentionally, calculatedly fragile. Its airframe would be built to the absolute minimum structural standard, just barely strong enough to survive normal flight loads, with almost none of the safety margins that conventional aircraft incorporated. Its systems would be stripped to the essentials. Its landing gear would be minimal, a bicycle-style arrangement with a single wheel at the front and a single wheel at the rear, with small outrigger wheels under the wings that would fall away after takeoff, leaving the aircraft to land on the two main wheels in a maneuver that required extraordinary pilot skill. The wings were the most striking feature. They were enormous, spanning more than 80 feet on an aircraft that weighed, fully loaded, less than 17,000 pounds. In relation to the aircraft's weight, these wings were more like a glider's than a conventional aircraft's. And that was precisely the point. At 70,000 feet, with air so thin that aerodynamic forces were a fraction of their sea level values, you needed enormous wing area to generate enough lift to keep the aircraft flying. The U-2's wings were essentially those of a powered glider, an aircraft designed not to fly fast and strong but to soar, effortlessly, at the very edge of the atmosphere. The engine was a modified version of the Pratt & Whitney J57, a powerful turbojet that had been specifically adapted for high-altitude operation, with modifications to its fuel system, its lubrication system, and its combustion chambers that allowed it to function in air so thin that a normal engine would simply stop burning. The fuel itself was a specially formulated kerosene variant with a low vapor pressure that prevented it from evaporating in the thin, cold air at extreme altitude. The result of all these design choices was an aircraft unlike anything that had ever been built. It looked strange, impossibly long and thin, with those great glider wings, a single jet engine buried in its slender fuselage, a cockpit perched on top like an afterthought. It was beautiful in the way that thoroughly functional things are sometimes beautiful. Every curve, every line, every rivet dictated by the relentless demands of the mission rather than any aesthetic consideration, and achieving something approaching elegance precisely because of that discipline. Johnson built the first prototype in secret, in 8 months, with a team of fewer than 80 engineers and technicians. The CIA funded it. The Air Force provided logistical support. Almost no one outside the project knew it existed. The first flight test, in August 1955, at a remote dry lake bed in the Nevada desert called Groom Lake, a location chosen for its isolation and its flat, hard surface, which would become famous in later decades under a different name, went better than anyone had dared hope. The aircraft flew. It flew high. It flew at altitudes that no other aircraft had ever reached. It was, from the very first flight, exactly what Kelly Johnson had promised it would be, a vehicle for seeing the unseeable, for flying where nothing else could fly, for operating in a realm of the sky that had previously belonged only to the imagination. Now all that remained was to use it. The pilots who flew the U-2 were a specific kind of person. Not just any skilled aviator could do what the mission required. You needed someone who combined extraordinary physical capability, the ability to endure 10-hour flights in a pressure suit that was essentially a personal spacesuit, in a cockpit barely large enough to move in, at altitudes where the outside temperature was minus 70 degrees Celsius, with a particular psychological makeup. You needed someone who was comfortable being entirely alone, in a machine at the edge of its design limits, over hostile territory, with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. The CIA recruited its U-2 pilots from the pool of military test pilots and high-performance aircraft specialists, and it recruited them with a combination of financial incentives. The pay was extraordinary by military standards, and appeals to patriotism and adventure that were carefully calibrated to attract exactly the right kind of person. The pilots were required to resign their military commissions and become nominal CIA employees, a requirement that served a specific purpose. If a pilot were shot down and captured, the U.S. government could more plausibly claim he was a civilian contractor rather than a military officer, potentially reducing the diplomatic damage. The training program was as unusual as everything else about the U-2 project. Flying the aircraft required learning entirely new techniques. The U-2 operated in what pilots called the coffin corner, a narrow band of airspeed at high altitude where the margins were terrifyingly thin. Fly too fast, and the aircraft would exceed its structural limits and break apart. Fly too slow, and the wings would stall and the aircraft would fall out of the sky. At 70,000 feet, the gap between these two speeds was sometimes as little as 10 knots, about 12 miles per hour. The pilot had to maintain that narrow band of speed through hour after hour of monotonous cruise, in a pressure suit that made precise control inputs difficult, watching instruments that gave feedback seconds after the aircraft had already responded. Landing was even more demanding. The bicycle landing gear, that single front wheel and single rear wheel, meant that the U-2 had to be brought down in a perfectly wings-level attitude, with absolute precision of airspeed and sink rate, or it would tip onto a wingtip and cartwheel down the runway. To achieve this, a second U-2 pilot in a car would chase the landing aircraft down the runway, calling out corrections over the radio: left wing low, hold it, until the aircraft was safely on the ground. Even so, ground loops and wingtip strikes were disturbingly common. The aircraft was, as Johnson had intended, an aircraft designed to fly. Landing was something of an afterthought. The cameras that the U-2 carried were as revolutionary as the aircraft itself. Designed by a brilliant optical engineer named James Baker, they used film of extraordinary resolution in a format that could photograph a strip of Earth 70 miles wide from an altitude of 13 miles. A single U-2 mission could photograph 750,000 square miles of territory in a single flight, more than all the aerial reconnaissance that had been conducted over Europe during the entire Second World War. The photographs were sharp enough to read the tail numbers on aircraft parked at Soviet air bases, to count the individual missiles at a surface-to-air missile site, to identify the model of tank in a motor pool from the distinctive shape of its turret. When the first U-2 mission over Soviet territory was flown in July 1956, the intelligence haul was staggering. The photographs revealed Soviet air bases, missile test ranges, submarine yards, nuclear facilities, and dozens of other high-priority targets that had been invisible to American intelligence. In a single flight, the U-2 had provided more actionable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities than all other collection methods combined had produced in the previous decade. It also revealed something that Eisenhower found both reassuring and alarming in equal measure. The Soviet military, while formidable, was not as large or as immediately threatening as the most pessimistic American estimates had suggested. The feared bomber gap, the belief, widespread in American military circles, that the Soviets had built a fleet of long-range bombers large enough to mount a devastating surprise attack, turned out to be largely a myth. The Soviets had far fewer bombers than the alarmists had claimed. This was enormously important information, with major implications for American defense spending and strategic planning. But Eisenhower knew something else that made the intelligence value of the U-2 missions complicated. The Soviets knew the overflights were happening. Their radar had tracked the U-2 from the very first mission. They knew an American aircraft was flying over their territory at extreme altitude. They just couldn't do anything about it, yet. Soviet radar operators watching the U-2 tracks on their screens saw an aircraft flying at altitudes their fighters simply could not reach. Their best interceptors, the MiG-17 and the early MiG-19, could reach perhaps 55,000 feet with a desperate zoom climb that left them barely controllable and immediately forced them back down. The U-2, cruising serenely at 70,000 feet, was 15,000 feet above anything they could touch. Soviet air defense commanders scrambled their fighters anyway, watching helplessly as the intruder crossed the country from border to border and departed without incident. Nikita Khrushchev, who had emerged as the dominant figure in the Soviet leadership after Stalin's death, was furious. He was humiliated. An American aircraft was violating Soviet sovereignty at will, photographing whatever it chose to photograph, completely beyond his power to stop or even respond to. He made formal complaints through diplomatic channels, protests that the American government blandly denied. The flights did not exist, the aircraft did not exist, you must be mistaken. The denials were, of course, transparent nonsense, and everyone knew it. But without the ability to shoot the aircraft down, Khrushchev had no proof he could present publicly. and without public proof, his complaints were unverifiable and ignorable. The Soviet response was to invest heavily in the development of surface-to-air missiles, guided missiles that could reach altitudes no interceptor could achieve. The SA-2 guideline missile, which the Soviets began deploying in large numbers from 1957 onward, had a maximum engagement altitude of approximately 60,000 feet, still below the U-2's operational ceiling but getting uncomfortably close. Soviet engineers were working to push that ceiling higher. The Americans knew this, and Eisenhower knew that the window of invulnerability was not permanent. Every mission over Soviet territory was a calculated risk, a bet that the Soviets had not yet deployed anything capable of reaching the aircraft. The U-2 pilots were not naive about this. They flew their missions with the knowledge that the technical margins that protected them were finite and shrinking. They flew with cyanide capsules, poison pills issued by the CIA, though most of them had decided privately that they would not use them if shot down. They flew with a cover story. If forced down over Soviet territory, they were to claim they had been on a weather research mission and had accidentally violated Soviet airspace due to a navigation malfunction. They carried forged documents and other materials designed to support this story. They also carried a pistol. Not because a pistol was useful against Soviet interceptors, but because it was standard equipment, and because having a weapon gave a pilot, in some irrational but deeply human way, a feeling of not being completely helpless. The U-2 flew over the Soviet Union 24 times between July 1956 and May 1960. Each mission brought back photographs of incalculable intelligence value. Each mission expanded the American understanding of Soviet military capabilities in ways that directly shaped nuclear strategy, defense budgets, and the conduct of the Cold War. And each mission flew closer to the moment when the invisible protection of altitude would fail. That moment came on May 1, 1960. May 1, 1960 was May Day, the great Soviet holiday, the annual celebration of the workers' state, a day when Moscow's Red Square would be packed with parades and the Soviet leadership would stand on the Lenin Mausoleum watching missiles and tanks roll past. It was, from an American planning perspective, an ideal day for a reconnaissance mission. Soviet air defenses would be occupied with protecting the parade, senior officials would be focused on the celebrations, and the routine disruption of a major national holiday might provide useful cover. Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in the pre-dawn darkness, his aircraft loaded with fuel and cameras and the various items of equipment, the cyanide, the pistol, the cover story documents, that every U-2 pilot carried on overflights of denied territory. His mission was to fly the entire length of the Soviet Union, from south to north, photographing a list of high-priority targets that included a suspected ICBM facility near Sverdlovsk and several other military installations, and land at Bodo Air Base in Norway. It was one of the longest U-2 missions ever planned, more than 3,000 miles over Soviet territory. Powers was an experienced U-2 pilot, calm and methodical, with the particular kind of professional detachment that extreme altitude flying seemed to cultivate. He had flown missions over the Soviet Union before and understood, in the abstract way that allows human beings to function in dangerous situations, that what he was doing was perilous. He climbed through the atmosphere over Pakistan, crossed the Soviet border south of the Aral Sea, and settled into the long, monotonous cruise that characterized U-2 operations at altitude. He did not know, could not have known, that the Soviets had been tracking him since he crossed the border. Their radar network, vastly improved since the early days of the overflights, had acquired him almost immediately. And this time, something was different. This time, the SA-2 batteries along his planned route had been notified and were preparing. The SA-2 missile system had been continuously improved since its initial deployment. The latest version had an engagement ceiling that had been pushed upward, classified at the time, and disputed even now, to somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 feet. Whether it could actually reach the U-2 was uncertain. Soviet air defense commanders, watching the blip of the American intruder on their screens, were about to find out. Powers was approximately 1,300 miles into Soviet territory, passing near the city of Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, at an altitude of around 70,500 feet, when the aircraft was hit. He never heard an explosion. What he experienced was a sudden, violent orange flash somewhere behind and below him, and the immediate, catastrophic loss of control. The aircraft, that delicate, impossibly fragile machine, had been caught at the edge of its altitude ceiling by the shock wave of a near miss from a Soviet SA-2 missile. The tail assembly was damaged or destroyed. The long, beautiful wings buckled. The aircraft began to come apart. Powers' account of the next few moments is one of the most extraordinary survival narratives in aviation history. The U-2, breaking up around him, went into an uncontrolled dive. The G-forces were so extreme that Powers could not reach the ejection handle. His body was being pushed against the seat with multiple times the force of gravity, and his arms simply could not move against that force to reach the controls. He managed, through some combination of instinct and training and desperate physical effort, to blow the canopy off and partially exit the cockpit, and was then torn free of the aircraft by the airstream, his pressure suit inflating automatically as he tumbled through the thin air at 70,000 feet. He did not activate the ejection seat. This was, in retrospect, fortunate. The CIA had incorporated a self-destruct mechanism into the U-2, a 70-second time delay explosive designed to destroy the aircraft and its cameras and equipment if the pilot ejected. Had Powers used the ejection seat, the mechanism would have been activated, and if for any reason he had not cleared the aircraft in time, he would have been destroyed along with it. By exiting manually, he avoided activating the mechanism, but this also meant the aircraft was not destroyed, and its cameras and equipment would fall largely intact into Soviet hands. Powers fell. His parachute opened automatically. He descended through the Soviet sky for what must have seemed like a very long time, watching the fragments of his aircraft falling around him, thinking about what was going to happen when he reached the ground. Soviet citizens on the ground near Sverdlovsk watched something unprecedented, an American aircraft breaking apart in the clear May day sky, a parachute opening, a man descending slowly toward the earth. Within minutes, local militia and eventually KGB officers were racing toward the landing site. Powers landed in a farm field, was surrounded almost immediately by Soviet citizens, and was taken into custody before he had a chance to do anything with the equipment he was carrying. The U-2 wreckage, scattered across a wide area, but with the camera section and much of the intelligence equipment relatively intact, was collected by Soviet authorities within hours. What they found was a goldmine of evidence: the camera, the film, the specialized equipment, the pilot's survival kit with its CIA-issue items, the poison capsule, the pistol. Everything that proved, beyond any possibility of denial, that this was not a weather research aircraft that had strayed accidentally over Soviet territory. This was a purpose-built spy plane, operated by American intelligence, on a deliberate mission to photograph Soviet military installations. Khrushchev, receiving this news on May Day, on the most important Soviet holiday, in front of the entire world, experienced a moment of extraordinary strategic opportunity. He had the evidence. He had the pilot. He had the aircraft. And he had a summit meeting scheduled with Eisenhower in Paris in 2 weeks, a meeting that both sides had publicly described as a crucial opportunity to reduce Cold War tensions. He decided to set a trap. Rather than immediately revealing what had happened, Khrushchev announced publicly that the Soviets had shot down an American aircraft over their territory, but he revealed only the fact of the shootdown, not the details. He waited. He waited for the American government to respond. And the American government, following its standard protocol for U-2 incidents, issued a cover story. A NASA weather research aircraft had gone missing over Turkey, its pilot possibly suffering from oxygen problems, and it had apparently strayed accidentally over Soviet territory. This was, of course, exactly what the CIA and the State Department had planned to say in the event of a U-2 loss. The cover story had been prepared in advance, approved at the highest levels, designed to be plausible and deniable. What the people issuing the statement did not know, what Eisenhower himself did not know, because the original assumption had been that no pilot could survive the loss of a U-2 at altitude, was that Powers was alive, in Soviet custody, and the aircraft was largely intact. Khrushchev waited 2 more days. Then he went before the Supreme Soviet and revealed everything. He had the aircraft. He had the cameras. He had the photographs the cameras had taken, which the film had been developed and printed. And he had the pilot, alive, who had already given a detailed confession to his Soviet interrogators. The American cover story collapsed instantly and completely. The State Department, faced with incontrovertible evidence that made their denial impossible, issued a humiliating correction. Yes, it had been a spy plane. Yes, it had been photographing Soviet military installations. Yes, the United States government had been conducting reconnaissance overflights of Soviet territory for years. Eisenhower, to his credit, did something that presidents rarely do. He accepted personal responsibility. He did not blame the CIA or claim ignorance. He stated publicly that he had authorized the overflights, that they were necessary for American national security, and that he took responsibility for them. It was an act of personal integrity that his supporters admired and that did nothing whatsoever to reduce the diplomatic damage. The Paris summit collapsed. Khrushchev arrived at the conference and demanded an apology from Eisenhower before the talks could proceed. Eisenhower refused. The summit, which had been intended as a major step toward reducing Cold War tensions, toward establishing some kind of stable relationship between the superpowers, fell apart in recriminations and mutual accusations. The brief window of possibility that had seemed to exist in the late 1950s, when both sides had been cautiously exploring the possibility of arms limitations and improved relations, slammed shut. The world came, some historians believe, measurably closer to nuclear war in the months after the U-2 incident than it had been before. The crisis of confidence it created, the humiliation it inflicted on both sides, the destruction of the summit process, all of it contributed to the atmosphere of mutual suspicion and hostility that would produce the Berlin crisis of 1961 and, the following year, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other point in the Cold War. Francis Gary Powers spent 21 months in Soviet custody. He was tried publicly in Moscow in August 1960, in a show trial that Khrushchev stage-managed for maximum international impact, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years. 3 years in prison followed by 7 years of labor. The trial was broadcast on Soviet television and provided Khrushchev with a propaganda platform that he exploited with considerable skill. Powers conducted himself at the trial with the kind of careful, measured dignity that the CIA had trained him for. He acknowledged that he had been on a reconnaissance mission and that it had been authorized by American authorities. He expressed regret, carefully worded regret that avoided anything that could be used as a direct indictment of American policy, and accepted the Soviet court's jurisdiction. He did not break down. He did not make dramatic statements. He was, in every external respect, exactly what the CIA had trained him to be, a professional who had been caught doing his job and was dealing with the consequences with minimal additional damage. He served 21 months before being exchanged on February 10, 1962, on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the bridge that divided West from East, the most famous prisoner exchange location of the Cold War. Powers was traded for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer who had been operating in the United States and had been caught and convicted in 1957. The exchange was conducted in the early morning darkness, in the formal, slightly theatrical way that Cold War spy exchanges tended to happen, both sides walking toward each other across the bridge, the transfers timed precisely, the whole thing conducted with the grim efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again. Powers returned to the United States to a reception that was more complicated than a straightforward hero's welcome. Questions had been raised during the trial, and continued to be raised afterward, about whether he should have done more to destroy the aircraft and its equipment, whether he should have used the cyanide capsule rather than allow himself to be captured, whether his conduct in Soviet custody had been sufficiently resistant. These questions were, in most respects, deeply unfair. The CIA's own investigation concluded that Powers had behaved correctly throughout the incident. The aircraft could not have been destroyed because the self-destruct mechanism required ejection to activate, and Powers had not ejected. The decision not to use the cyanide was his own, and it was a reasonable one. The CIA had issued the capsule but had never explicitly ordered pilots to use it. But the questions persisted in certain circles for years, a reflection of the Cold War culture's tendency to measure everyone involved against an impossible standard of heroism and sacrifice. Powers himself was troubled by them. He felt, for the rest of his life, that he was not fully trusted by the agency that had sent him on the mission, that the implicit accusation of insufficient courage or insufficient commitment was never entirely withdrawn. He died in 1977, when the helicopter he was piloting for a Los Angeles television station crashed after running out of fuel. He was 47 years old. It was, in its way, a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by aviation. Not a dramatic death in the Cold War spy game, but an ordinary, terrible accident of the kind that happens to pilots every year. The U.S. government posthumously awarded him the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the National Defense Service Medal in 2012, more than 30 years after his death, a belated acknowledgement that whatever questions had been raised about his conduct, he had served his country faithfully in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. The U-2 itself did not retire after the Powers incident. If anything, the aircraft's program expanded. The missions over the Soviet Union stopped. Eisenhower suspended them after the Paris summit collapse, and they were never fully resumed. But the U-2 found new roles in the rapidly changing strategic environment of the early 1960s. It was U-2 photography, taken on October 14, 1962, that first identified Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba, the photographs that triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Without the U-2 and its extraordinary cameras, those installations might not have been identified until the missiles were operational, at which point the options available to President Kennedy would have been far more limited and far more dangerous. The U-2 flew reconnaissance missions over China, over the Middle East, over Cuba, over North Vietnam. It flew missions that were never publicly acknowledged and that remain, in some cases, classified to this day. It proved, over and over again, that Kelly Johnson's improbable design, that fragile, glider-winged, impossibly delicate machine, was one of the most capable reconnaissance platforms ever built. The aircraft that replaced it, the State Route 71 Blackbird, also built by Lockheed's Skunk Works, also designed by Kelly Johnson, was in almost every respect its opposite. Where the U-2 was fragile, the State Route 71 was massively strong. Where the U-2 was slow, the State Route 71 was the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built, capable of sustained cruise at Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound. Where the U-2 relied on altitude for its safety, the State Route 71 relied on speed. By the time a missile was fired at it, it was already miles away. The State Route 71 was the answer to the question of what you build when altitude alone is no longer enough protection. But the U-2 never went away. The Air Force is still flying U-2s today, the same basic design that Kelly Johnson drew up in the early 1950s, updated and modified and improved through 70 years of technological evolution, but fundamentally the same aircraft, with the same enormous wings, the same bicycle landing gear, the same extraordinary altitude capability. Modern U-2s carry sensors of extraordinary sophistication, synthetic aperture radar, signals intelligence packages, communications relay equipment, that go far beyond the cameras of the original design. But they fly at the same altitudes, using the same basic aerodynamic principles, protecting the same kinds of secrets. The pilots who fly them today go through the same kind of training, face the same coffin corner at high altitude, still need the chase car and the radio calls during landing. They wear pressure suits that are direct descendants of the ones that Francis Gary Powers wore on May 1, 1960. They fly an aircraft that is, in the most fundamental sense, the same aircraft that first crossed the Soviet border in July 1956 and returned with photographs that changed the world. The story of the U-2 is, at its core, a story about the relationship between knowledge and power, about what you will do to know what your enemy is doing, about the extraordinary lengths that nations will go to when they feel threatened and blind. It is a story about the ingenuity of engineers who solve problems that other engineers say cannot be solved, about the courage of pilots who fly machines at the edge of their design limits over territory where no help is available and no rescue is possible. It is also a story about the limits of technology. The U-2 was supposed to be invulnerable. It was not. The Soviets worked, patiently and methodically, until they found a way to reach it. And when they did, they brought it down, not with an interceptor, not with a dogfight, not with any of the dramatic confrontations of conventional air warfare, but with a missile fired from the ground by men who had never seen the aircraft and could not see it even as they fired. The missile didn't need to see it. It just needed to reach high enough. The lesson is one that every generation of military technology has to relearn. There is no such thing as an invulnerable weapon. There is only a weapon that has not yet met the threat designed to defeat it. The U-2 was the most capable reconnaissance aircraft in the world, flying at altitudes no other aircraft could reach, protected by a margin of altitude that seemed, for 4 remarkable years, to be absolute and permanent. It wasn't. Nothing is. But for those 4 years, for the 24 missions that crossed the Soviet heartland and returned with photographs of incalculable intelligence value, For the information that shaped American strategy and reduced the risk of a nuclear war built on ignorance and fear, the U-2 did what it was designed to do. It flew where nothing else could fly. It saw what nothing else could see. It operated at the absolute edge of what aviation and human endurance could achieve, in the service of a nation that needed, desperately, to understand an enemy it could not see any other way. The plane that could not be shot down. For 4 years, it was true. The Lockheed U-2 first flew in August 1955. It conducted its first overflight of Soviet territory in July 1956. Francis Gary Powers was shot down on May 1, 1960. He was exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel on February 10, 1962. The U-2 program continues to operate today, more than 70 years after its first flight, making it one of the longest-serving aircraft in American military history. The State Route 71 Blackbird, its successor, was retired in 1998. The U-2 flies on.